2 weeks ago, I released an ambient EP of sorts titled 14 Lines. I say of sorts because although initially I started writing an EP, I soon realized that I was creating a single piece with 4 movements. If you want to listen to it spoiler free, the link is in the description and you'll be able to find it on my channel. But if you've already listened to it, or like me, you enjoy hearing backstory before jumping into long extended pieces of music, stick around, grab a chair. I'll be breaking everything down. The broad concept of the piece is addressing self-imposed pain. There's a lot to be said for music's ability to make you feel certain things that you weren't initially feeling. While listening to the piece, especially around the second movement, I wanted to create a feeling of unease, of sadness. I found myself thinking a lot about insecurity and doubt, and I realized that a lot of my personal pain comes from here. I feel like we humans become complacent. We realize that we have flaws, certain lifestyle choices that we shouldn't be making that's hurting us. But we'll go, no, I'll address that thing. I'll eventually get to work on the thing that's causing me anxiety. But we procrastinate and become passengers in our own minds. And if you're anything like me, that just leads to you feeling like you might not have been doing enough. Hey, you want the scoop? Here's some insider baseball. Creators very often are not very sure of themselves. I think that's why musicians find comfort zones, because challenging ourselves might mean taking a step into something we know we want but aren't good at yet. In an attempt to do exactly that, for the first movement, I started by completely changing the way the guitar is tuned. Like completely unrecognizable, and to my eternal shame, I cannot remember what the tuning was. I do know that I tuned the low E string to C. The point was to remove any form of a comfort zone I have on the instrument. I couldn't use any licks that I'm familiar with or any chord shapes that I've grown comfortable with. I realized I kind of lost agency in my playing. Every time I needed to write a solo or arrange a piece of music, I would fall back on the habits. If you're a guitarist, using a different tuning for a while can really help getting you out of that comfort zone. For the first movement, I wanted to score the feeling of not entirely trusting yourself to be able to do what you've set out to do. After detuning the guitar, some obvious creative choices were made. Really minor, I decided to use modes that are a bit more tense, long droning root notes. This would become a theme I would later discover. And then a lot of harmonic tension even within the major chords. Instead of having full uplifting moments, there aren't any moments of full rest within the first movement. Major chords in this kind of piece almost feel like the "you can do this" that slips in between the insecurity. But in this case, they feel faint, they don't feel strong. The motivations we hear along the way in times of struggle are often way more grounded than the insecurity. More often than not, you really can do this. But harmonically, I didn't want this first movement to feel like an outside observer's opinion on a tense situation. I wanted to feel like a person who's in this hole telling you this story. I will address the elephant in the room. I realized that using a clock sample to convey a sense of tension has been done before, but it works. So I think a great deal of our stress comes from time, not its physical movement or those implications. Those are terrifying within themselves. But our perspective of it, it feels like it isn't truly set in stone. That's because it isn't. We invented clocks. We invented the way we measure time. One of the most profound scientific things we ever figured out is that time most very literally is relative. The fact that a very interesting YouTube video feels like it's 15 minutes even when it's half an hour, and a really boring one like this one feels like 2 hours long. Thanks. But time, having too much of it, having too little of it, having enough of it, but not having anything to do with it. Perhaps having a lot to do with the time you've been given, but not being sure if what you want to do with that time is worth doing. You might have noticed I slightly sped up the clock sample. This was initially to match the idea I had for the guitar part. But because we know how fast a second is supposed to sound, it had the added benefit of making the piece feel rushed and tense. Here are some of the other samples you'll hear I used in the first movement. found that a lot of tension comes from these distant vocal parts. This is a technique that's used in film scoring all the time. It feels sad. I intentionally used a lot of scooping, not because I'm not a tight vocalist, but it's really cool. It almost feels like it never rests, like it's never entirely locked in, like it's disconnected. Obviously, this is where the music kind of gets weird and the ambient genre really comes into play. Insecurity and doubt feel like very similar concepts, but I don't think they are. Insecurity is often a precursor to doubt, but where insecurity is fighting off these voices, doubt is kind of like taking what they've been saying as evidence. Again, like the first piece, I didn't want this to be a positive opinion looking down at a person who's struggling with doubt and insecurity. I wanted to show a doubtful perspective. Because of that, when I was writing, I knew I wanted an oppressive, all-encompassing drone. And initially that was going to be the whole piece. It was going to be a bit longer and was going to be this very long, ominous drone. But I was playing around with the pitch shift plugin I used, and I rediscovered that you can pitch shift by the cent, breaking all kinds of rules within harmony. Peter, what are cents? Thanks for asking, viewer. Let me explain. Mathematically, the modern Western music system that we use for the most part is divided into octaves, which is then further divided into 12 semitones. But then there are the forbidden subdivisions that we don't really use called cents. These are the spaces between tones. These are used in the classical context when sliding between two tones. It's called a glissando. And on guitar, similar vibes are sometimes created by using a slide. Blues players have locked into using tones between tones. And obviously there are great examples of modern composers using microtonal music. Jacob Collier is obviously the first one that comes to mind. In my opinion, a well-trained classical musician does this incredibly. There's a really good example of this in Adam Neely's reharmonization of Hello. I wanted to tonally represent the continuous battle between peace and distress. So I started with two tones perfectly matched and then gradually let them glissando in opposite directions. This makes the interval between them mathematically very tense. Because our brains are so used to classical harmony, the relationship between these tones slide out of what we want to recognize as music. But every now and then one of the tones corrects to harmonize with the others, but the microtonal shifts persist. Every time one of these dyads form, the other one moves away again. There are these moments of rest, but the tension is ever present. You can tell I really like horror ambience and ambience that's used in tense filmmaking. Near the end, I took some inspiration from Hans Zimmer's use of the shepherd tone to try and push this tension to a natural climax, a breaking point. Again, tension as a tool to convey emotion is unmatched within music because consonance, it's almost like it has no value if we don't have dissonance. A weird sample I really enjoyed using within this piece is a royalty-free sample of an office telephone. Time stretched to the point where you can't recognize it anymore. With tons of reverb and delay, it almost creates this tearing, screaming feeling. I don't know how to explain it, it's tense. At some point I introduced more grounded musical ideas, some arpeggios, but I intentionally chose intervals that are still very tense. And again, because our brains are so used to hearing normal music, your brain latches onto this guitar part as like that's the new key we're in. Just like last time, here are some of the ambient sounds you'll hear within this movement. Again, the point was to create tension. You'll hear a lot of vocal work in this one as well, and I'll be honest, this one was a bit of a challenge. For I was no longer just in one key, I was very much blurring the lines in that department. The ambient drone was the first part I made, and then that was locked in. That was the first thing I made, and then I made the first movement and then the last movement around that. But when I wanted to add the vocal parts, I was like, oh, I don't know how I'm gonna sing over this. So what I did was a combination of recording vocal improvisations over the already pitch shifted drone. This meant matching the new keys as it changed to it. This whole thing must be a nightmare if you have perfect pitch, which actually might make the point come across even more so. recording over the already pitch shifted lines and then harmonizing to that, and then applying the same pitch automation parameters to one of the vocal parts as well, so it changes automatically when the drone changes. Wowza, Peter, a lot of jargon in this video. I'm sorry. The point is that your brain doesn't feel like it's allowed to rest until the end of the second movement. But aha! It was a false sense of security and it's merely a repeating cycle of pain. The basis for the third movement is a single repeating line. I wanted to create a sense of being trapped in a cage. After all this tenseness that happens in the second movement and all these sounds and this tension, it erupts into this chord and we almost feel like we finally rested. It almost feels at peace in this new chord progression, but then we slowly realize there is no progression. This is all there is. The melody is slow, almost like it's looking for something. Again, I used some vocal work to double the melody I recorded on the acoustic guitar, and I almost wanted to create this, like there's an outside observer following this melody line, trying to see, I see what you're doing, I'm trying to help, you're not alone. But they seem disconnected. We seek escape, and ironically, this often takes the form of almost enslaving choices. The chord progression is much simpler harmonically than the last movement, but I almost wanted to create the sense of an endless scroll. Now you might think, because the image I use in the video is that of procrastination and social media, that the message is phone bad, social media rot brain, darn millennials. Honestly, I think social media is a great tool. I'm sweating like a pig. Honestly, I think social media and online platforms can be an incredibly powerful tool for good, and I'd be a hypocrite if I said social media bad. I'm trying to be a YouTuber. Please like and subscribe. The reason things like social media are damaging is the passive nature with which we use them, trying to distance ourselves from our pain. YouTube, for example, is home to so much enriching content, whether it be educational or just entertainment. The point is that you're making an active decision to what you're consuming. Most people will be able to relate there's a distinct difference between deciding I am now done with work, I will now rest, and the rest that gives you, being stressed out and trying to find solace in food or social media, whatever. You're not working, but you're not resting. I realize that I sometimes try to escape to a comfortable place, but that almost becomes a chain around my leg, like people who eat to feel comfort or dive into much more damaging substances. There's a reason I used the image of a man trapped in a void with no light but from his phone, and I'll get to that later. I always tell people, use the internet actively. Decide, I want to look at memes or listen to music or whatever. Because this maybe I'll find happiness, maybe I'll find a dopamine release 2 scrolls from now. That way of thinking tightens the rope.
14 lines from love letters or suicide notes.
I've always loved the practice of scoring poetry and spoken word. I'm gonna wear my influences on my sleeve with this one. A while back, KMAC 2021, yes, that one, the Meme Lord, released a 4-track piano EP of like this ambient piano music, and it blew me away. And around the 12-minute mark, he had put music to Carl Sagan's Pale Blue Dot.
But who speaks for the human species? Who speaks for Earth?
It's an incredible piece on Earth and its history and the human condition. I knew I wanted to do something similar, so I had started looking for nice pieces of spoken word or poetry, but I couldn't find anything that 100% matched what I wanted to say. Some honorable mentions: Carl Sagan, Jordan B. Peterson. They have some great pieces that could definitely be scored. And personally, I still really want to put music to Charlie Chaplin's monologue from The Great Dictator. It's been done before, but it's just such an incredible piece of cinema. I thought of other great monologues from film, but I couldn't find anything that tied in to this idea of self-imposed pain through passiveness. And then I rediscovered Doc Lubin's 14 lines from love letters or suicide notes. This is an incredible piece of work, and it blew my mind the first time I heard it. It draws parallels between this great joy and immeasurable pain. On the one hand, you have this theoretical person who's making one of the most worthwhile decisions of their lives, and on the other, you have this theoretical person who's in such a low point that they don't feel like they have any hope. It spoke to me because the clip I used is Doc reading his own poem, and you can really tell he knows what it feels to be in love, and he understands what it feels to be at that low point. Love letters and suicide notes are many things, but they can't be passive. No one writes a love letter passively, and no one writes a suicide note passively. These are profoundly active decisions. To me, this is a poem about a theoretical person who's been stuck in inactivity for so long and need to make a decision to change where they are. I wrote the guitar that accompanies it intentionally hopeful. I wanted the music to resolve into the final movement, but not just jump to the tonic of the key that we were in. Instead, I wanted to change what your ear perceives as the root. I wanted to change what your ear perceives as the key that we are in. An escape from the cage of the lost movement, to be sure, but not one that takes you back to where you were. I wanted to change perspectives. Because now your brain wants to latch onto the poem first. That's how our brains work. We hear lyrics first. We hear words first because that's the language we speak in. The tension is no longer within the music. It's a dissonance between what is being said and what is being heard within the music. Intentionally juxtaposing Doc Lubin's honestly quite bleak poem with hopeful cadences, I attempt to create this sense of knowing, rest, that you are not alone, that there is a greater power in control in our protagonist's darkest hour, and that all hope is not lost. Like I said, when I wrote this, I wanted to use hopeful chord progressions. I retuned the guitar back to standard and I used chord progressions that I'm at peace with. I wanted to create the feeling of a father saying, I love you, I care for you, I have hope for you. But I feel like we sometimes forget that there are people so low that they will grab at any opportunity to feel in control. I finished the piece on the fourth. It is an unresolved chord, not truly dissonant, but nevertheless being pulled towards the tonic, begging to go home. I would like to discuss the visuals that I decided to pair with the music. For the video, I worked with longtime friend and collaborator Gerduan Kemp. He found a way to have what was in my brain come through the lens, and he really helped me tell this story. And that was no small task. I had this idea of, instead of creating a visual story and then putting music to it, I almost wanted to create music and score it with the visuals. I knew that the piece had to do with insecurity, and for me as a creator, a big part of that is doing something that I will then show to people. I started with the idea of recreating my process when I sit down to record these discussional videos, but then putting myself in the worst possible emotional state to film a video. I tried matching the somber tone of the music by showing a determined man, showing the you can do this, in spite of the voices telling him he's wasting his time. My first couple of videos before I really found my groove were torture to shoot. For my first video, the Why I Love YouTube rant, I shot the full thing and I couldn't salvage it in editing because it was just such a mess. I wasn't able to convey my thoughts because I was constantly second guessing myself and I didn't want to do it again. I had wasted a whole day filming and trying to edit that video, but after a bit more planning, I sat down the next day and that resulted into that little 6.5 minute video I posted like 9 months ago. What no one sees is the roughly half an hour of footage of me messing up lines and stumbling over my words that I edit out. There are some cool editing techniques you can use to show more or less time passing. Hard cutting from an excited Peter to a demotivated Peter creates this almost time dilution like you find in a dream. It makes it feel like, oh, where'd that time in the middle go? Whereas when I match between two takes of me doing roughly the same thing, it feels like those are happening in a short amount of time. I tried to show the motivation slipping slowly in the beginning, but near the end of the second movement, it's sharp and sudden, almost like there's more doubt than motivation. In our protagonist's lowest point, he gives up on trying to convey his point and grabs at an escape. I mentioned this earlier, but the idea of the video isn't phone bad. Oh, millennials be like, and all the boomers go, yes. But the image of a man in a void with no light on him but that from his distraction. It's a representation of the place we put ourselves when we try in vain to escape. I sometimes spend an hour or 2 hours scrolling through, honestly, garbage. And I know it's bad for me. And I know most people do it as well. Sometimes we feel like we want to escape. I said this before, if you want to use the internet to relax, it has to be an active decision. Whether it's memes, music, or TikTok compilations, just make an active choice. Your brain knows the difference. Because when you passively decide to just switch your brain off and scroll, you're doing the internet equivalent of standing in front of the fridge even though you're not really hungry. A moment of clarity breaks our character from the void. Just like the music changes drastically for the fourth movement, I wanted to have a hard cut to that vibrant green, the cool and the calm that opposes the cold lie of the passive procrastination. I mentioned earlier that your brain is able to tell there's a disconnect between the poem and the music you're hearing, so I wanted to use visuals that emphasize the peace that the music creates. The ending seems negative. After all, the protagonist seems like he's giving up on the thing he set out to do in the beginning. He gives up trying, just like I did before my first video. I needed to reevaluate. Just like the unresolved chord isn't yet home, I wanted to show that there is no rest in the way that our protagonist was thinking. Our protagonist needed to make an active decision to change the way he was trying to deal with the voices. I wanted to show that the hope he needed wasn't sitting in that chair. Before ending this video, I want to thank a few people. Firstly, I mentioned Gerduan Kemp. He shot the whole video. He's a great musician in his own right. He has a YouTube channel as well as a video podcast about creatives and their fields. I wholeheartedly recommend it. I'll leave some links to those things in the description. Secondly, a massive thank you to Jonker. He took this whole thing to another level. Mixing and mastering are incredibly hard things to do with normal music, but with this weird ambient stuff, I took him a rough mix and he performed actual wizardry to make all the little sounds come out, and especially with ambient soundscapes, that is vital. So the piece would not have been what it is if not for his work. He's the recording engineer and music producer for the Hidden Track Sessions. It's a great channel shining light on independent musician, great project. Please go check them out. I will leave links in the description. If you haven't subscribed, please do so by hitting the button or clicking on my face at the end of the video. It really helps the channel grow and it's free. And then finally, if you haven't listened to 14 Lines yet, please go check it out. Let me know what you think. Thank you so much for being here. Goodbye.